Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about Fort George. We did want to thank Steve and the Oakville Historical Society for asking us to speak tonight. Dan and I are both very passionate about Fort George and getting to share stories about the site and why it's so important to our early history. This year is also really special for us because it is the 210th anniversary of the Battle of Fort George. So tonight we have a special treat. We've put together a presentation that's going to talk about Fort George, but Dan also has some original artifacts from the Battle of Fort George that he's going to be sharing this evening with all of you. And we just want to plug too, we have our new book, Fort George, A History. Dan and I co-authored this with several local authors, and this is what our presentation is based on this evening. So Fort George National Historic Site and the military land that surrounds it have a history that stretches back over 250 years to 1765. However, archaeological evidence of human occupation of the Niagara Peninsula dates back to over 11,000 years. The site where Fort George sits today was traditional Anishinaabe territory, with the Seneca on the eastern or American side of the Niagara River and the Mississauga on the western side. The first Europeans to arrive in the Niagara area were the French, and they arrived in the early 1700s. And the Niagara quickly became a very important part of the fur trade route. In 1726, the French began building Fort Niagara, which was a stone fortification that was established as a trading post and quickly became a military fortification for the French as tensions between the British and the French began to arise. So I'm hoping you guys can see the mouse there. I just want to highlight this part here is the Niagara River. This part down in the forefront is the western shore, what is now Niagara on the Lake. And this area up here, that is Fort Niagara, and that is the stone castle. Now, Fort Niagara's position is really important because you can see the Niagara River here flows right out into Lake Ontario, and it is surrounded on two sides by water. And at that time, water was really important because it acted like the QEW of the day. All of your trade goods and your supplies would have traveled by water because roads were either insurpassable through winter or non-existent. So the position of Fort Niagara was really vital. Now, the British did gain control of Fort Niagara in 1759 during the French and Indian Wars, and they were actually at Fort Niagara for almost 40 years, including through the American Revolutionary Wars. Fort Niagara became a really important spot for Loyalist refugees who were fleeing from inland United States and coming to Fort Niagara. It was also a really important spot for Butler's Rangers. They used it as their main site where they would travel out for their operations. However, in 1783, when the British started meeting with the Americans to discuss peace negotiations, essentially what they did with Lake Ontario is they looked at splitting it right in the middle, with the Americans taking one half and the British taking the other. And Fort Niagara ended up being turned over to the Americans. The British who were stationed here in Niagara really understood the vital role that Fort Niagara played in the security of the Niagara area. And so they really dragged their feet with actually leaving the fort, even after peace negotiations. And it wasn't until 11 years after the American Revolutionary War ended with the signing of Jay's Treaty that they actually began to think about moving out of Fort Niagara. And this is another image we wanted to show you. We found when we were doing research for our book. This is a James Peachy print from the 1780s, and you can see Fort Niagara in the background there, and then in the forefront would be Niagara today. I also wanted to highlight this one. You can see the Indigenous peoples just in the left-hand corner, highlighting the fact that this was predominantly their area until very recently in history. So when the British started leaving from Fort Niagara, they needed to find a place to go, but they didn't travel too far away. In 1764, the Seneca had signed a peace treaty with the British that provided them with a strip of land on both sides of the Niagara River that would allow them for communication and trade purposes. And during that time in 1765, the British actually built Fort Niagara, which you can see, Navy Hall, which you can see in the image there. So in the forefront here is Fort Niagara, and just on the opposite shore there right here is the Navy Hall complex that the British built in 1765. Now, Navy Hall at that time included a storage building, a barracks for officers and tradesmen, and a substantial dock that included cradles and slipways for construction of new vessels and the repair of older boats. From 1792 to 1796, Navy Hall then became the home of Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, until he moved the legislature to York, at which time Navy Hall was again adapted to be a supply depot for all goods and supplies coming in for the British. They would be stationed at Navy Hall. So when the British were looking for places that they could build another fortification to counterpoise Fort Niagara so that they would still have some command of the Niagara River, they ended up choosing this hill just above Navy Hall as the site for Fort George. It would allow them to look out over Navy Hall, also keeping an eye on the Americans on the eastern side. Now, this is an early map of Fort George, and I think Dan has the original one here this evening that he's sorry. I love this one. This is an early 1800s map showing the construction of Fort George. So Fort George was constructed in early 1796. The original fortification was constructed primarily of men from the 2nd Battalion of Royal Canadian Volunteers and Queen's Rangers, both of which were provincial regiments. They were responsible for quarrying the stone, felling the trees, hewing the lumber, and excavating the ditches to make way for Fort George. Now, it is important to note that Fort George was never really built to be a military fortification per se. It was more what was termed a field fortification. And it started out as just a small collection of buildings, including a large blockhouse and a powder magazine. And originally there were no ditches, no bastions, anything that you would think of that would make it an actual military fort. Its main function was to protect Navy Hall and the supply route. By the early 1800s, though, the garrison had started to resemble a military fort. Bastions and gun emplacements had been put in place, and a palisade wall was erected along the waterfront to give it some privacy and protection from Fort Niagara. Now, the back of the fort itself in the early 1800s was all wide open, and this area here was all common land that was used quite commonly for grazing animals. So when Captain Henry Bruyere of the Royal Engineers in the early 1800s visited Fort George, he noted, quote, "The works at Fort George are considerably injured by the quantity of cattle that are continually grazing and treading over every part of them." And I like to think that that is what forced the British hands to actually start enclosing the rest of the fortification to protect it from the cattle and other animals that were treading in there. But by 1803, Fort George consisted of 3 soldiers' barracks that were located here. Now, these 4 buildings just in front of the barracks, we're not 100% sure, but we believe those were the soldiers' kitchens where they would have cooked their meals. This is the guardhouse. This building here was the officers' quarters, and this is the officers' kitchen. Right here you have your military hospital and military kitchen. This building here is the powder magazine, and then this here is the octagonal blockhouse. So by 1803, Fort George looked very much like a military fortification and what was represented in Surgeon Edward Walsh's print. So this is Edward Walsh's painting of the interior of Fort George, and it's one of my favorite because it's actually the only interior image we have from that time period that shows us what Fort George would have looked like pre-war. So just to highlight here, you can see in the background here is the guardhouse. This is the officers' quarters, which looks quite lavish with all the trees and stuff in the gated area in front of it. Tucked in behind would be the officer's kitchen. You have the military hospital here. And I just want to highlight, peeking out under below the ground there is the roof for the powder magazine. That is the only building that survived the War of 1812 at Fort George, and it is still standing today. It is original, and it most likely is the oldest military building in Ontario. So if you come visit Fort George, you have to come and see this building here. The other thing I wanted to highlight was the animals that you can see. Prior to the outbreak of war, the officers had some very exotic pets at Fort George, including bears and foxes that you can see. But as time went by, tensions between Great Britain and the United States began to escalate, pushing the two countries towards conflict. By that time, Fort George was the headquarters for the Center Division of the British Army and the main fortification on the Niagara frontier, and was therefore an integral part of any defensive plan for the province. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Dan, who's going to cover War on the Niagara.
Okay. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to go back, actually, just for fun. If we're looking, we are coming from you tonight from that building right there, blockhouse number 1. Okay, so we're going to start right here. So I'm going to go over really talk about the Battle of Fort George. We're certainly, I don't think, or nor do we all have time this evening to get really into all the campaigns of certainly of the War of 1812. So I'm really just going to concentrate on the one that directly affected Fort George, and that is really in the middle of the war in spring of 1813. I do want to mention that the territories that we are built on were certainly traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee as well as the Anishinaabe. And really the reasons why this area is important to them, and Amanda alluded to this, is the same reasons that the Europeans were interested in the area, and that has to do with the waterways and transportation. If we think of where we are located, it is on the St. Lawrence Seaway of the day. The Welland Canal didn't exist, roadways were horrible at best, and obviously we're very much before the railways. So waterways were it as far as getting things really from point A to point B. And from a military perspective, it's a very simple idea. If you own the waterways, you will own your enemy, period. And so for that reason, the entire length of the Niagara River all throughout the war is a very heavily contested piece of real estate because it really has huge strategic value for both sides in this conflict. You can make life exceedingly miserable for your enemy in very short order if you can actually cut off their avenue of supply. And that's truly the reason why the Niagara area was so important. So moving on in time a little bit, the Americans, 1813, their initial plans were to raid York. That was never meant to be to stick around there for any length of time. Raid York, destroy some of the military, or particularly the naval stores there, and then head to our area at Fort George, and then use that as the foothold with which to take the province, ultimately taking Kingston, which opens eventually the doors, certainly to moving further east into Lower Canada. But anyways, so York happened on April 27th, 1813, and the Americans, it was a very successful amphibious assault. And then they hung around, as I mentioned, for a short period of time, just for 4 days, the usual mayhem that you get with an occupying force, a little bit of looting, and they certainly burnt a number of public buildings there. And then that army sailed across Lake Ontario and then encamped themselves in behind Fort Niagara. So just back in this area in here. And for the next month, we watched them gather more troops, gather more ships, gather landing craft, which are essentially large, let's say 30-foot rowboats that can fit 30 to 50 guys in them. And they also started to construct artillery batteries, and 5 of them, number 1 being just outside of Fort Niagara, and then keep going. 3 is pretty much directly across from the fort, number 4, and number 5 was down here. If we sort of think about that for a second, so if you're firing here, or the Americans are, this direction, that kind of puts us in a wee bit of a precarious spot, certainly when it comes to artillery. We had a total of 5 guns on the inside of Fort George with which to defend ourselves. Oddly enough, and conveniently enough, I think, for the enemy, when the Americans raided York, a whole bunch of artillery that we captured at the taking of Detroit, which was scheduled to come to the fort here to up our artillery, I guess, numbers, got captured during that particular raid. So what we had is really all that we are going to be using. So 5 guns on the inside of Fort George. And so anyway, sort of my point, to give you an idea, distance-wise, it's only about 1,000 yards across the river, and more importantly, to Fort Niagara is roughly 1,400 yards. Every single one of our iron guns that we have on inside of the fort have a range of at least 2,000 yards. So everything we have certainly can hit Fort Niagara, and an important, I guess, saying that applies here, and it applies actually to the military in any time period. If your enemy's in range, so are you. And that becomes an important point in just a second. So again, anyways, my point is that obviously we can see all of this activity that's happening. We can see it, we can hear it. And in the case now of several thousand troops encamped in behind Fort Niagara, we can also smell it. If I need more proof on this, which I don't think we do, I think it was pretty obvious we know what was happening. It certainly comes from a report that was written by the guy in charge here. His name was Brigadier General Vincent, and he wrote a report to his boss in Quebec on May 19th, so less than a week before the actual battle itself, or the bombardment, my apologies. And in this report, I'm just going to grab a little quote from it because it's my favorite quote actually from the War of 1812, because to me it is such a perfect example of typical British understatement of the situation that's happening here. And he wrote, "With the exception of an almost constant and ostentatious parade of troops, artillery, and boats upon the opposite shore, nothing else deserving of notice is happening upon this frontier." He does go on to mention everything else I just said, and that he said the obvious intention of the enemy will be invasion. So really, for us, it was just a matter of waiting for the inevitable. What Vincent did is he took all of his troops and put them about 1 kilometer away from the fort. So he didn't leave the infantry inside of the fort. He left his artillery back here because obviously they're going to bombard us. We've been watching them build those batteries. And so he put his troops here. And so we had managed to gather at this point about 1,350. The Americans at this point had over 6,000. So, I mean, even just from those numbers, you can probably gather what the likely outcome of this is going to be. So Vincent put his troops here for a couple of reasons. One, we don't know where the Americans are going to land. Are they going to land here along the river, or are they going to land along the shores of Lake Ontario, or both? You put them here. One, they're out of artillery range. That's always good. And the other one is it's relatively easy to get to either flank here. And then so he divided into 3, a group to keep an eye here, another group to keep an eye on the river itself, and then keep another one back in reserve. And so that's what we did. And as I mentioned earlier, waiting for the inevitable. Well, obviously it came. On the morning of May 25th, 1813, the guns of Fort Niagara and all those 5 batteries, and perhaps a few of the naval vessels joined in the fun as well, opened up on Fort George, well over 30 guns, firing a really simple projectile. It's a solid iron ball, and these things weigh anywhere from 9 pounds, 12, 18, 24 pounds, but they've been heated up in a furnace, red hot before they get fired. As these things come crashing into our buildings, they're certainly doing damage, but more importantly, they're setting them on fire. And after an 8-hour barrage, every wooden structure inside of Fort George was ablaze. So really, with the exception of the powder magazine, Fort George effectively ceased to exist. And so what we have today now at Fort George is a reconstruction of the site as it appeared, let's say, around 3 o'clock that morning. But by about 12 hours later, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we were pounded into a smoldering ruin. So that's all well and good. And so it's certainly inconvenient, to say the least, from our perspective, but it doesn't mean a lot unless you can actually take ground and hold it. And so that was part number 2, and that came 2 days later. And the Americans didn't end up actually landing along the shores of the Niagara River. They ended up landing along this area right here. So that's about 6 kilometers or so from the fort. And this is between 1 and 2 Mile Creek, actually, just along the lake shore. Just actually, for those who are familiar with Niagara Lake, and I believe one of you certainly is, Mr. Woods, right here is actually the area we call in town Chautauqua. So there's a little neighborhood right in here. Just in this little area right here is a military reserve to this day, and actually is the old rifle range. This is really ground zero right here. And this is really where the American Navy came into play. And they had at this point 14 ships. And I don't mean the big things that you see on the oceans at this point, but still these things had 4, 6, 8 guns. And so you could have a broadside of anywhere from 2 to 6 guns. And you multiply that times 14, that's an incredible artillery battery opening up. And if you think of D-Day, where you've got the big ships covering the landing, firing over top of the landing craft as they went in, softening up the defenses along the shoreline, this is exactly what the Americans did. It's not a new tactic, obviously a different technology, but it worked just as well. They kept our heads thoroughly down until they hit the beach. There they had a bit of a cliff or an embankment, roughly 20 feet, so not too bad. 3 times they scrambled up that, 3 times we beat them back literally at the point of bayonet. But on the 4th time, it's really now numbers and firepower that are really starting to win the day. They were able to get onto the shore proper, and this is really when the battle itself happened in earnest. That traditional European style line versus line battle. And it was short and it was nasty. Best description I've come across actually comes from an American general who was right in the thick of it that day, right on the beach. His name was Boyd, and he described the Battle of Fort George simply as, for 15 minutes, the two sides exchanged a rapid and destructive fire at a distance of only 6 to 10 yards. Excuse me one moment, my apologies. In a modern sense, that's the alarm to remind me to give the medication to my daughter. So my apologies for that. Okay, so really the same 2 words again, numbers and firepower, is really at this point, after that 10 to 15 minutes, is when the British were really forced to break, and we were forced to retire. And we fought a retiring action all the way along this area and ended up really just right around here, which is still there today, St. Andrew's Church, although a different version of it. And right in this area right here, the British artillery and the militia artillery set up and bombarded, well, hammered the American lines as they were approaching. And that really allowed us to be able to escape. I won't say unharmed, but allowed us to be able to escape anyways without being taken out en masse. Also at the same time as all this is the main line of the Americans and the main group, but they also had another group going along here, following in this area right here, and a rifleman included, and they also had another one following along the shores of the river. So really at the end of the day, once you start closing these things in, which was at this point the obvious intention of the enemy, then we would have been surrounded at that point. So it was really at this point Brigadier General Vincent gave the order to everybody, that's it, we're retreating right out. And also for any of our emplacements along the river, such as Queenston Heights, Chippewa, and including Fort Erie, were all abandoned. And then we followed the river up to the escarpment, and everybody followed that all the way back to Burlington Bay. And that was it. And that was the end of the battle. And pretty heavy casualties, roughly 350 or so on the British side. And when you think about a 1,350, 350 casualties in around 10 minutes is pretty catastrophic. But because 1,000 were able to get out of here, that did certainly set the stage for future, certainly, engagements, and eventually allowed us to be able to, with the help of our Indigenous allies, be able to get this area back. But it took 7 months, and we don't, I think of this often in Canadian history, although this might be a matter of perspective depending on where you live. This town, this area, and a good chunk of the Niagara region, at least certainly in the early part of that summer, was all American soil, and this area remained American territory for the next 7 months. So I'll leave it there, but if you could stop sharing. I've got some things that I think we can directly relate to the battle. I just want to show you.
Where are we?
I just hit the...
there we are.
There we go.
Sorry.
So I might need to do this a little bit. I'm sorry.
No, you go for it.
Okay, so we'll start off with that initial battle, that 10 to 15 minutes that Brigadier General Boyd talked about. And I mentioned the fact that we were able to beat back the Americans at the point of bayonet. So I think appropriate to literally, here is a bayonet. And nasty things, this one's got a 16.5-inch blade. But the reason why I have this is it's actually from the King's 8th Regiment. The main regular regiment that was doing the fighting back at the point of bayonet were primarily the King's 8th Regiment. And these guys also, when that actual line versus line battle happened, took it in the teeth. They took by far this the most casualties of any other unit that was present on that day. So I cannot say for certain that this particular bayonet was necessarily right there along the shores in the battle, but certainly the odds of it being here in the Niagara area are quite high. So that one I wanted to show. I also want to mention Indigenous were also part of that initial force, as I like to put it, there to initially greet the Americans upon their arrival. So again, that whole little bit about beating them back down onto the shore. And what I have here is a, you can call it a pipe tomahawk or a pipe axe. And this is certainly one of the weapons that they carried. They most often carried a combination of both European style weapons as well as traditional weapons. This one is typically for a close hand. This one isn't from Niagara, at least not that I'm aware of. It certainly is original, so it's the right time period, but I don't think this was in the Niagara area. This is part of the Parks Canada collection. Other things. These weren't fired, but were found in the vicinity. Now, without records, I can't tell you what that means, but gives you an idea of what each side were firing at each other. So this is a British ball. We fire 75 caliber muskets, but they fire a ball that's slightly smaller, and that allows it to be loaded quickly. But this one right here has not been fired because they tend to flatten upon hitting absolutely anything. But anyways, that's the 69 caliber lead ball. And absolutely horrific. If you think of this at that 6 to 10 yards, it's going to be going close to 1,000 feet per second. And these things are soft lead, tend to pancake a little bit, hitting anything solid. I'll leave that there, leaving absolutely, obviously horrific injuries on the enemy. What the enemy was firing at us is a different kind. It's called buck and ball. So they're firing, and their muskets are smaller. They're 68 caliber, so they're firing a 62 caliber ball. So there's one there. But they also had 3. If you can just see that, it's a little hard. 3 little buck. It's like a little BB. They're all made out of lead. And the British found this really unsportsmanlike for them to be able to do this. But what it does, it does spread out a little bit as it leaves the barrel. So it does increase your chances. I won't say dramatically, but certainly significantly anyways, if you're actually hitting something when you fire that out of the barrel, of which ours is horribly inaccurate. One of the reasons why you like to fight in large groups is because it makes up for the failings of the weaponry of the day. Other things we got, now this one is certainly a special one for us, this is a breastplate. I keep getting that wrong. This is a breastplate right here, and this is from the 4th Lincoln Regiment. And the Lincoln militia was certainly at the Battle of Fort George, again, part of that whole division that was along the shores of Lake Ontario. They also took quite a number of casualties as well. And this particular one belongs to the 4th, as I mentioned. And the 4th Lincoln Regiment was stationed at Fort George, certainly at the very beginning of the war. And a whole bunch of elements of the Lincoln militia were certainly at the battle. So for us, we have different levels of artifacts. And I guess if we want to use a very layman's term, the super wow stuff for us is anything that we can directly relate to the site that actually was here or belonged to somebody who walked these grounds, of which I've got 10 in my entire collection that we can actually say that, and that is one of them. So pleased to have that. Pleased to be able to show you that. We have another one. I'll show you that in a minute. Other things I've got, again, found in the vicinity. So that makes it a little hard. Oddly enough, it came from the Lincoln Museum. They called me up a couple years ago, said, we got a bunch of stuff that we think was, I think, dug up around our area, no doubt pot hunters, and then donated to their museum somewhere along the way. And so I said, sure, I'd love to see it. And it turns out there's a number of small artillery projectiles, I guess is the best way to do it. This is a canister shot. And this could be either British or American. Both actually had 6-pounders at there, and 6-pounder canister literally is a tin can, so probably about that big in diameter, probably about yay long, and you've got close to 2 dozen of these iron balls in there. They're 1.1 inches, and when it leaves the barrel of the gun, it spreads out, wreaking absolute havoc upon approaching lines of infantry. So it's kind of gruesome. These certainly might have been at the battle as well. Another thing we got, this one I apologize, you might not be able to see, but this certainly was at Fort George. It's an archaeological, it's from an archaeological find. I'll get as close as I can there. Done in 2011. And it was found near where the building called the octagonal blockhouse was on our site, and that was a storehouse, and it was destroyed during that American bombardment. These were all found in a great big pile, and we know that they were storing this stuff in that particular building. So this is a result of that American bombardment. So, and we had found a whole cache, hundreds of them. This is just one of that. Lastly, I think that's everything as far as the battle goes. This doesn't necessarily relate to the battle itself, but I had to show it. Amanda had, and you probably this is the original, and this is our we bought this a number of years ago, so this is part of the Fort George / Parks Canada collection. So for us, yeah, it's early 1800s, and for us, this is definitely that super wow or level 1 resource for us, because this, it doesn't get any better for us. This shows ideally, this is the problem with plans, is that sometimes the plans are what you want to be there, but from all documented resources and archaeological research that's been done over the years, this is very consistently what we think Fort George certainly looked like. Probably just up until prior to the war. The only really big difference, I would say, is this octagonal blockhouse back here was enclosed in a triangular, we call that a ravelin, so a little, it basically had a fence surrounding it. And by the time of the Battle of Fort George, there was an earthen berm or hill protecting the powder magazine. Other than that, this is perfect. Okay, so I will leave it there. Are there any questions at all for?
Looking for more great content like this? Why not check out the Oakville Historical Society's website, YouTube channel, or Facebook and Instagram pages?